Hey YouTube, this is Drew Tech here, and today we're going to go over 10 mistakes new Linux users make. So now, when people first get to Linux, they more often than not make some mistakes, because hey, after all, we're all human, we all make mistakes. And I made some of these mistakes when I first got to Linux. So we're going to be going over like the top 10 mistakes, at least in my opinion, that new Linux users make. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, number 10, expecting Windows. Now, when a lot of people first get to Linux from Windows, they just expect everything to be the exact same as it was on Windows. And that's a mistake, because Linux and Windows are two different operating systems. They work fundamentally differently from each other. Then they go try to use it like they did Windows, and then like, oh, this is too hard, and then they just give up. At least part of the reason why people expect Windows is because everyone in the Linux community says, oh, Linux is just like Windows, and you can do everything that you did on Windows. Like, do you see why the Linux community says that? I think that that's a mistake, because when you tell people that Linux is like Windows, they expect Windows. And that's a bad image to put in new users' minds. So just remember this. Linux is not Windows. Windows is not Linux. They're two different things. Like, the Linux community does a lot of great stuff, but I think this one part where they market it to new users as being just like Windows is just one area where the Linux community has just completely and utterly failed. Alright, number 9. Trying to find and install software the wrong way. So now remember what I said about Windows is not Linux? Well, the same applies here. Like, you know, on Windows, if you want to download a new program, you just go to the website, download the executable file, and run the setup. That's how it most often works on Windows. Sure, you do have the Microsoft Store, but more often than not, people are going to be installing software through executables. And Windows software comes from every which way. And on Linux, you have what's called a package manager, which is basically a centralized repository where you get all your programs. Like, that's where most of the software you use on Linux is going to come from. It's kind of like an app store on your phone, or like the Microsoft Store that you had on Windows. Alright, number 8. Trying to use the Windows directory hierarchy on Linux. So now this, again, pretty much ties with my saying Windows is not Linux. So now the thing is, on Windows, you type, for example, C:\\whatever, and you'd use backslashes to represent folders. The thing is, I think like some new users try to type it into terminal and then they get errors. Now Linux uses forward slashes for its directory hierarchy. Basically, C:\\/ equals forward slash, if you know what I mean, and you'd use forward slashes to separate folders, if you know what I mean. So now, I just want you to remember this phrase I'm about to tell you. Windows thinks backwards, so it uses backward slashes. Every other operating system thinks forward, so it uses forward slashes. And hey, that's why everywhere on the web uses forward slashes. Like, the only time when you'd ever use a backslash in Linux is if you wanted to put a space in a file or folder name in terminal. So like, if you wanted to do that, you'd put a backslash before the space to tell terminal that the space is not the end of the directory, it's actually a space in the file or folder name. But other than that, you don't ever need to use a backslash in Linux. Alright, number 7. Assuming updates will be done for you. So now, you're probably used to on Windows having your computer automatically update for you. However, when you get to Linux, you cannot rely on that, because Linux is always coming up with new security updates and bug fixes, and of course on occasion new feature updates, but those have to be initiated manually, unlike on Windows. Now, a lot of beginner-friendly distributions like Ubuntu will remind you to update when it finds a new update, but you have to manually click install. That's the thing, on Linux, updates are not done for you, which is actually great, because then you can choose when to update, in case you're right in the middle of doing something, or you can just stand on older Linux kernel version, like for example if it has a feature that you like. You could just never get an update, though that's not recommended for security updates. Stay on top of your security updates. But yeah, just remember this. Linux does not do updates for you, unlike Windows, which you actually may like. Alright, number 6. Choosing the wrong distribution. Now, don't get me wrong, distribution does not matter. And in case you're new to the channel, I actually proved that in my Can I Use Debian Like I Use Ubuntu video, which I'll link up in the card. But anyway, being able to pick whatever distribution you like, that's later in your Linux life. First, you gotta learn to customize Linux. But like in the meantime, when you just get started, you wanna go with something that's beginner friendly, that'll be kind to you right out of the box. For beginners, I always recommend going with Ubuntu because it's the most beginner friendly in my opinion, and it has the most support. Like, I also personally provide support for Ubuntu, mainly. But if you just really want that Windows look and feel right out of the box while you're learning to customize it, my other suggestion would be Linux Mint. Alright, number 5, distro-hopping. So like, I hear about this a lot, where people just don't like the look and feel of the distribution that they're on, and then they'll go find a new distribution. Or they choose the wrong distribution and they keep distro hopping, and then after all, they'll probably just give up. Like, no. If you're doing that, stop doing it. What you really need to do is learn to customize Linux. And I have actually made a video showing you how to make Ubuntu look like macOS as a starting point. I'll link that up in the card. But anyway, like, a lot of Linux distributions are pretty much the same, like when you get past look and feel. So yeah, don't just choose a Linux distribution based on its look and feel. Stop killing yourself just installing, reinstalling all the time, trying to find the perfect distro. No. You need to learn how Linux works. You need to learn to customize it. In fact, I personally have my Ubuntu installation looking a lot like Mac OS. Like, here's a picture of what vanilla Ubuntu looks like by default. Here's a picture of what I made it look like. Now, a new user would look at the two and think that they're a completely different distro. I want to tell you, they're the same distro. That's the customization power that you have on Linux. It is unfathomable. Alright, number 4 is logging in as root. Okay, this is another one that's problematic with security when you get past assuming updates will be done for you. Now, a lot of new users will just get in the habit of logging in as root or switching user to root because they don't want to use the sudo command. Just want to say this is so bad on so many levels. Because one, if you forget to log out as root and you run an untrusted application, well, that's how you get viruses on Linux. Even though viruses are uncommon on Linux, you can't take that for granted. And 2, when you make new folders and files, like all of the file permissions are assigned to root, meaning that when you exit the root user and you get back on your user, it'll have 0 write privileges to every file and folder that you made on root. I know, that sucks. Don't make that mistake. Don't be that guy, because I know some people that have been there. It's not fun. Alright, number 3, skimping on passwords. This is another one that is so bad on so many levels and is just extremely stupid. Now, some people are used to just having no password on Windows, which is a completely insecure thing to do. If you have no password, set one. Just do it. And then when they get to Linux and they're forced to have a password, they'll try to find some way to circumvent it. Just want to say, there's a reason why Linux by default enforces passwords. Don't try to get around it. Also, the login automatically option that you may see during installation, that is intended for rare circumstances like virtual machines. Like if you're running a virtual machine, that's the only time when it's okay to skip on a password. On your daily driver system, you need a password. And in case you really don't want a password, I'm gonna say this again. You really need a password. Like, if you don't have a password on your daily driver system, well, I'm sorry, but you're just really stupid, to be honest. Alright, number 2. Worrying about defragmentation and malware. And I'm guilty of this one. So now, when I first came over, that's one thing I worried about, is defragmentation. Like, I'd always just run E4 defrag, and just like defragment my hard drive, because I thought it would make a performance improvement. But actually, now that I think about it, it didn't actually do anything to improve my performance, believe it or not. And malware. I used to like try to find a Linux antivirus when I found out that my Windows antivirus wasn't compatible with Linux. By the way, one thing I did is I actually tried to run an antivirus in Wine, which is also a kind of stupid thing to do because it only scans your virtual C drive if you do that. In fact, I even used like the ESET antivirus, which is compatible with Linux, just temporarily, while I had the free trial. I was actually even considering buying it, but really, what I need to learn is that Linux is pretty good with security. It's a secure enough operating system that you could get by without any antivirus, especially since I already had protection in the browser. The thing is, a lot of new users will ask, oh, what defragmentation program should I use? Oh, what antivirus should I use on Linux? And the answer is none. Linux does not need a defragmentation program. Linux does not need an antivirus. It does not need a defragmentation program because Linux uses much better file systems. Like Windows uses FAT and NTFS. Like NTFS in particular for its boot drive. Those are both really dated, proprietary, and to be honest with you, pretty crappy file systems. Like, part of me is wondering why they're even standard. Like, the file systems for Linux, like ext4, BetterFS, XFS, like all those Linux file systems are superior to their Windows counterparts in every way as far as speed, reliability, optimization, those kinds of things. Linux file systems are arranged in such a way that, like, you pretty much never need to defragment it. Like, the only time when you ever do need to defragment a Linux hard drive is if a partition's at least 80% full. Like, in that case, if you're actually noticing a performance hit, running E4 defrag might not be a bad idea in that case. But I don't know, like, how many people have a hard drive partition that's at least 80% full. So yeah, like, I think, like, that's a rare circumstance. And in terms of antivirus, Linux is just much better at keeping itself protected because, one, it's a lot more locked down because it has package managers rather than having software coming in from every which way, and applications run in a low privilege mode by default. Whereas on Windows, applications have control over your computer. Now, you do have UAC to mitigate the risks, but it's not perfect. And the thing is, like, Linux is just much more secure in the back end. So you don't need to worry about anti-malware either, especially if you already have them in the browser. And if you ever download a program from the internet that you don't trust, you can always use a website called VirusTotal to scan it, which will use not one, but a bunch of antiviruses. I think like 70 antiviruses to scan that file. Now, like, if one antivirus that you've never heard of says it's a virus, but everything else is green, it's probably fine. Like, if you're on Linux, just use common sense and best practices, and you'll probably be better protected than a Windows user with, like, the best antivirus in the world. Like, especially one that doesn't use common sense and best practices. So yeah, on Linux, you don't need to worry about defragmentation and anti-malware either. Like, remember this phrase I'm about to tell you. Windows is all about cure. Linux is all about prevention. Alright, number one, trying to use Wine to run Windows exclusive programs on Linux, and I'm guilty of this one. When I first came over to Linux, I had a few Windows exclusive programs like iTunes, for example. Like, that's really the only one that I still have. These days I just run it in a virtual machine. Basically, like, I tried to run it in like pure Wine, and it was just frustrating when it just didn't work. And really what I need to learn is just to run it on a separate partition or even a virtual machine. I also need to learn that there's actually a better method to running stuff in Wine, which I made a video on that. I'll link that up in the card. But anyway, like, when it comes to running stuff in Wine, you're much more likely to be able to get it working by running it in Wine via Lutris or playing on Linux than, you know, like, pure Wine. It's counterintuitive, I know, but anyway, like, that's later in your Linux life. Once you've learned a thing or two about Linux, then you can go check out that video. But anyway, like, running stuff in Wine doesn't work well. Even if you do use a good method, compatibility with Linux for Windows software is hit or miss. It's very spotty, if you know what I mean. So yeah, like, when you first get to Linux, don't even attempt to use Wine. If you do, at best, you'll just have unusable programs, and at worst, you'll break your Linux installation. By the way, I actually have done that. Alright, so now, for sticking around to the end, I get a bonus fun for you. And that is improperly removing Linux from a dual boot. This is the one I am most guilty of. Like, when I first tried out Linux, first I had a bad experience with it, or just wasn't installing programs. I think maybe I just got a defective installation somehow, or I did something to mess up that installation. When I went to remove it, I simply just deleted the partition. Then I reboot, surprise, surprise, error, no such partition. That just sucks. And really, what I need to learn is that there's actually a proper procedure to remove Linux from a dual boot. Like, installing it on a dual boot is not so hard. Like, even my mom can do it. Like, the hard process actually comes in when you want to remove Linux without doing a full reinstallation of Windows. Okay? I actually do have a couple videos showing that. One for UEFI and another one for Legacy, because the process will change depending on what BIOS you have. I have that in my dual boot config playlist, which I'll link that up in the card. But anyway, like, don't make the mistake of just simply deleting the partition and being done with it. Don't be that guy, because I've been there. It's not fun. And I actually did have a Windows ISO on hand. Then me and my brother just ran a few commands that I should have ran before just simply deleting the partition, and then it was back to normal. Then when I tried out Linux again, that time I really liked it, so I just kept it and slowly, naturally switched over. But anyway, that is my list of 10 mistakes new Linux users make. 11 if you count the bonus. So thanks for watching. If you liked this video, found it was helpful, hit the like button, share this video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment.